and welcome to my channel. Have you ever asked yourself, either as an aspiring project manager or practicing project manager, how information flows into the project, outside the project, and also within the project? Don't worry, in this video, I'm going to take you through one of the very important components or tool in a project management setup or program management setup. It's called communication. You need to appreciate and understand what is communication in a project setup or in a program setup. Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Oscar Mbira. I'm a certified program and project manager. This is the channel which I use to help aspiring and also practicing project managers to succeed. So in this video, I'm going to take you through all that is required in terms of communication in a project or program environment. So let's dive in. So we are now going to go through the communication process in a program or project. Let us understand. Communication in a project, it's not all about sharing information. It goes beyond that. There are so many benefits of doing communication in a project. One of them including team collaboration, also clarity, and also achievement of project timelines. So, what is this communication? Communication covers a broader spectrum in terms of project management. You need to understand 6 basic concepts of communication or 6 basic components of communication. So, the first one is what to communicate. If you're a project manager, which is you should be able to understand from a bigger picture what needs to be communicated. We are going to go through these components for you to appreciate how you formulate the communication strategy document. So after understanding what needs to be communicated, for example, you might want to communicate end of stage or end of phase. For example, you might want to communicate if there's an exception. You might want to communicate, say for example, you have missed a deadline, or maybe you have lost your biggest customer or your biggest supplier, or there is a major catastrophe in the project. You might want to communicate. So that is very important if you're a project manager. It is very important for you to understand, if you're a project manager, what exactly are you supposed to communicate. Communication, remember I said it before, communication can be outside the project, or it can be into the project, or even within the project. But what exactly do you need to communicate? That has to be very clear if you're a project manager. From my experience, that is one of the first things I always make sure that I document what needs to be communicated. I hope you've enjoyed the video so far. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to click the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification button so that you're the first person to be notified each time a new video is uploaded on this channel. It will also help the channel to grow. It can also help the channel to produce more videos like this one. Then, the second component is, why do you have to communicate? That is very, very important. You cannot just communicate to anyone for whatever reasons. There must be a specific reason you have to communicate. Say, for example, what I normally do, I communicate with my team members, especially when there's something that is towards the deadline, and I just want to remind them. So the why part, or the reason why I'm communicating with them, is to remind them that a specific task is either due or the due date is imminent. That will help the project team members to also appreciate the agents and probably work on it, and then to avoid any timelines slippages. So that is very important. As a project manager, you should always appreciate and understand, why do you have to communicate. For example, you want to communicate to project board about a specific milestone that has been achieved. So the main reason why you're communicating is achievement of a milestone. That is very, very, very important. Then the third component of it is when. So when are you supposed to communicate? In other words, we are talking of the frequency here. At what frequency are you supposed to make the communication? For example, if you are communicating with project board members, most of them, they don't want to be involved into the day-to-day running of the project. So therefore, they might end up suggesting that, let's have it maybe after a month, maybe during the start of the project, which can be changed towards the end of the project. So they might suggest that we want the communication or progress in the project after a month. So you find that after a month, you have to prepare the required documents, the required reports, and then you communicate with the project board. So when to communicate is very important. For example, if you have got your team members, there's something that you know is a bit complex, you find that the regular or daily communications are very important than weekly or monthly communication. So when to communicate is very important, and you must consider that as a project manager so that you don't miss any type of communication that might be required at any given point of the project. What I normally do myself is to make sure that I create the stakeholder analysis properly, and then make sure that each and every stakeholder you identify the communication. I'm going to cover that in a few seconds to come. So after understanding when to communicate, you also need to appreciate where to communicate. You don't just communicate. There are some cases where you need to understand exactly how are you supposed to do the communication. Is it going to be done in a face-to-face? Are you going to do it in the project office? Are you going to do it in head office? If it's you have so many geographical locations, that is very, very important. You need to know where are you going to do the communication as a project manager. Then, after understanding where you're supposed to do the communication, you also need to appreciate how are you going to do the communication. Sometimes, from what I've seen with my experience in other projects, when it comes to how are you going to communicate, there are some cases where probably just a report is enough. So how are you going to communicate? You communicate through a report. That becomes very, very simple. And then, after understanding how you are going to do the communication, one also important point is who is actually going to do the communication. That is very, very important. You don't want communication to be done by anyone, especially if you're working on a very sensitive projects. You don't want everyone to just be communication. You do not want everyone to just be communicating to everyone at any given moment. It must be controlled. So who is going to communicate is a very, very critical question you should answer during the startup phase of the project. For example, you might say, when it comes to communication to the board, then it means the project manager is going to do that. When it comes to communication to the, say, technical committee, of course, as a project manager, you might be available, but your lead technical person should be the one to communicate to the technical body or to the technical committee, just to make sure that in terms of the domain language, they are using the right domain language. So that is very, very important. Who is going to communicate? It must be very clear in terms of roles and responsibility. One of the most important activity to be done by a project manager or project team member when you are formulating the communication strategy is to start with what is called a stakeholder analysis. So what is a stakeholder? A stakeholder is anybody, any individual, any company, any entity, any regulatory authority that has got interest in the project. So let me say it again. What is a stakeholder in a project? A stakeholder in a project is any individual or business, organization, or any entity that has got interest in the project. So why are we understanding and reflecting on this definition of stakeholder? Stakeholder analysis is the first stage that starts when you want to formulate any communication strategy in a project program. So what is stakeholder analysis? Stakeholder analysis is after identifying all the stakeholders, anyone who has got interest, anyone who has got interest, anyone who has got an influence into the project. We all consider those ones as stakeholders. So you want to communicate with these stakeholders. How do you start? Where do you start from? You start by creating what is called a stakeholder analysis matrix. I'm going to show you this as we go. So what does this matrix contain? It's going to contain what information are you supposed to communicate with whichever stakeholder you have in the project. You also want to establish why do you have to communicate that information with that specific stakeholder. It is very important. You want to make sure you understand why a specific stakeholder they require that information. For example, in my experience, I've seen that if you're running a project, say for example, it's a construction project, you normally have some agencies or inspectors who wants to inspect the building, for example. They want to understand, is it being done according to best practice in terms of safety of the public, for example? Is it being done according to those laws and local regulations? So the why part of a stakeholder is very important. You need to answer the question, why that stakeholder must be communicated to in the project or throughout the project. Then when you're doing stakeholder analysis also, you need to establish when are you supposed to communicate with the stakeholders. That is very, very important. You need to understand why I should be communicating and when I should be communicating with the stakeholders. There are certain stakeholders who might want some communication, say after a certain milestone, okay? There are others who might want it on a certain frequency of saying every month, every year, depending on the type of the project, depending on the size and how long you're going to be implementing or running that project. So the when part, which is the frequency, is very important when you're doing stakeholder analysis. So on your stakeholder matrix, you must answer the question, when are we supposed to communicate with this identified stakeholder? That line must be very clear. You specify at what frequency are you supposed to communicate so that people, they get information in a timely manner. You do not want some information to reach others when you're almost through with the project and they are communicating information from the beginning of the project. That will not make sense. Then also, as part of your matrix, in your stakeholder analysis, you also need to understand where are you going to communicate this information. Is it something that you have to go to your head office to communicate? Is it something that you have to do virtually to communicate? Or is it something that you think it can be done maybe through a phone call? So it's very important to understand. Then the next part of it in your stakeholder matrix creation is who is going to be responsible for that communication? Who is going to be responsible for that communication? Is it the project director? Is it the sponsor? Is it the project manager? Is it the team lead? Or is it just a team member? Or even quality assurance team, or audit team, compliance team? That is very, very important. You must be very clear in terms of who is supposed to do the communication and when are they supposed to do the communication, why are they doing the communication, and who is going to benefit from that communication. Then the last part of it on the matrix is to identify how are you going to communicate. To be honest with you, from what I've seen in my projects before, different stakeholders, they have different requirements. They have different preference in terms of how the communication should be done. Some might say an email is enough. So how are you going to communicate with them? You communicate through an email. That is accepted in some environments. Then you find some environments they want face-to-face. How do you communicate? They'll tell you, if we are going to have any project board meeting or steering committee meeting, it has to be face-to-face. So it means you have to travel from wherever you are, you have to travel to have a face-to-face meeting at project board level. I've also seen some cases where others would say an email is enough, or even a phone call is enough. Some may even say a voice note is enough in terms of how you should be communicating with those specific stakeholders. So the how part of it is very important. You need to understand. It's very important that you understand how are you going to communicate with any of the identified stakeholders in a project. If you have understood what are the channels that can be used in terms of communication in a project or in a program environment, don't worry, I'm going to take you through all the channels that you need to use in terms of communication in a project setup. So let's dive in. So the first item we are going to look into in terms of communication channels in a project or program setup environment is meetings. I don't think there's anyone who has never attended any meeting in any corporate environment. Meetings these days, they can be done in two parts. It could be virtual, which means you can do it online using tools like Zoom or even Teams. So that is the first part of it. Second part of it, it can be done physically, which means you have to travel or you have to move from one office to the other for you to have a meeting. But in all cases, a meeting is very important for communication, it's very important for collaboration, it's also very important for stakeholder alignment. So during the meeting, one of the very important points you have to consider when you're running the meeting is to make sure that everything is quite documented, everything is also summarized, everyone is very clear on the agenda of the meeting, what has been discussed, everyone is very clear in terms of action items from the meeting. If you want to understand or you want to learn more about how to run effective meeting, I've done a video on how to run effective meeting. You can also check it on my channel to appreciate how to run effective meeting and therefore allow your project to be very successful. So the second channel that you can use in a project or program setup is emails and memos. So these days, emails, I have to be honest with you, I've tried using emails in my project. They're a bit slow in terms of communication. Can you imagine you can send someone an email around 8 in the morning and then you find that person responding to you around 6 in the evening. So as much as emails, they are very good, especially when it comes to record keeping, I find them very slow these days. If you try to use other platforms, like for example, you try to use your WhatsApp or even Skype, you find some of them, they're a bit faster as compared to emails. However, that does not stop you from using emails as a communication channel in a project setup or project environment. You can also use memos just to send to members or any stakeholders to appreciate what is happening in the project. So it is one of the channels that you can use for communication in a project setup, emails and also memos. But just make sure that in terms of your emails or memos that you are sending, there's no ambiguity. Everything should be very clear in those communication channels, email and memo. And also make sure everyone has got access either to the memo or to the email. You must be very sure in terms of the distribution list, who are the recipients of that email, so that you don't send email to the wrong people. You end up confusing everyone because the information that goes there through that email, maybe that group of people, that individual was not expecting that to come to them, so it will cause confusion. That is very, very important. The third channel that is very common in a project communication setup is to use project management tools. You have heard about Asana for project management. You've also heard about Trello for project management, even Microsoft Project for project management. So these tools are also very important when it comes to communication. Say, for example, you have a specific task to be completed by any of the project members. Using either a task manager or you're using even a project plan, you can communicate with the team to say, this specific task was supposed to be completed on this day and is due either in 2 days or it's already overdue. You need to work on it. So that is very, very important. You should learn to use tools in a project setup. These days, it's very easy to use some of these tools and they make the communication a bit faster. So project management tools are also another way or a channel or channels in a project which you can use for communication, and you should make use of them. That's what I normally do in my project. I always make sure that I use tools. They help to automate some of these things, like reminders. They also help to automate some of these things like report extraction and also progress updates and so on and so forth. So I would advise you from my experience that you should always be using project management tools in terms of communication channels. Now, the fourth channel that you can use for communication is the reports. You can also use reports as part of your communication. Say, for example, you were running a certain phase of the project or a certain stage of the project, and it's almost completed. You want to communicate, for example, lessons learned from that phase, or you want to communicate follow-up actions from that phase. So you can put it as a report, and then you can share it with the specific stakeholders so that they can understand in terms of that phase, what was done right, what was done wrong, and how do you consolidate the gains from that specific phase. That is very important. You can also use the reports. For example, if it was an exception report, which means you have gone past a specific deadline, you want to ask for additional budgets, for example, additional funding, then you can produce a report that can clarify what actually transpired, which led to the current situation where you might need additional budgets. So a report is also very, very important. The other item I've seen as a communication channel in a project used by others is surveys. I've used surveys once in one of my projects where you want to get as much information as possible from project members, or you want to appreciate where the specific approach is working. Say, for example, you're using agile approach or waterfall, even hybrid. You want to appreciate if that is working or it should be changed. You can throw out a survey to your project members, you get feedback. So that kind of feedback you're getting is also part of communication. Someone is telling you what is working well and what is not working in a project. That is very, very important to consider as a project manager. So as a project member or project manager, you might be asking yourself, or you might be wondering, what is the impact of effective project communication in a project environment or in a program environment? Don't worry, in this video, I'm going to cover the 4 most important impacts that you can see or you can have in a project communication through the project communication process. So let's get started. I hope you've enjoyed the video so far. If you are new to the channel, don't forget to click the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification button so that you are the first person to be notified each time a new video is uploaded on this channel. It will also help the channel to grow. It can also help the channel to produce more videos like this one. So the first impact of effective project communication is alignment of stakeholders. If your communication is very clear and concise, avoiding any ambiguity and confusion, and if your communication also is very timely, which means you're communicating it the right time when it's required. It does not make sense. Say, for example, you're already closing the project, then you're communicating about project kickoff. It does not make sense. So your communication must be timely. Okay? So as long as your communication is timely and also is very clear what you want to communicate, it's going to remove a lot of confusion. And it's going to make sure that all the stakeholders involved in that program or project, they're aligned on exactly what are the objectives of the project, what is the scope of the project, what are the major milestones of the project. That is very, very important to consider if you're a project manager. I've used it in my project, you should be able to use it in a project. The second impact of effective communication in a project setup or project environment is to make sure that you are also increasing collaboration amongst your team members. Collaboration is very important. Teamwork is very important in every project setup. So how do you make that teamwork very effective? How do you make that teamwork very collaborative? You have to make sure that you are doing the communication right. So if you are doing your communication right, you'll find that team collaboration naturally becomes very easy. But if your communication is causing confusion or anxiety in the project team, you would find that there's no collaboration. People are not very clear on exactly what they're supposed to do, or whether they're going to use some inputs from another team, or they're going to use some outputs from another team for them to achieve project tasks or for them to complete end project deliverables. So if you want the team collaboration to be very high, just make sure that your communication is very effective in a project setup. That is very, very impactful in a project setup. So the third impact that you normally get when your communication is very effective in a project setup is mitigation of risks. Remember, communication is not one way. It's communication outside the project, communication into the project, and also communication within the project. And it's normally a two-way communication. It's not always from project leadership all the way down to the team members. Communication also can even come from the bottom up or top bottom, like that. So, how does it impact the effectiveness in a project? It's good for risk mitigation. There are some project members who are very good at picking some risks, which you, as a project manager, you might fail to pick them early. So if your communication is very effective and open, these members can even approach you as a project manager to say, as much as you're putting effort towards achieving this particular deliverable, are you aware that a specific customer is going under? And this specific customer is the one who is going to be the beneficiary of that specific product that you want to create in that project. Just an example. So you, as a project manager, you note that as a risk, that you're working on a project to produce a specific product, and the targeted customer is actually going under in terms of business operations. So who is going to use your product? Then you start managing risk from there. For example, instead of focusing on that only customer, you might try to widen in terms of the use of your product by other customers. Already, you're mitigating the risk against that. So also, if your communication is very clear, I've been in a project where one of our very key member resigned. And he was key, I'm telling you. But I was lucky because I normally set up a very open communication system in my projects. One of the members had to pass that information to me and said, this specific member, I'm just going to call them X, is about to leave the project and the organization. And there's no one else who knows what he's doing. So I had to take that as a high risk. I started looking around for replacement. Fortunately, I was lucky to get one from outside with almost the same skills to replace that individual. But imagine if my communication was not very effective, or maybe it's blocked. It's only top to bottom. I was never going to get that information, and I was not going to be able to mitigate against that risk. So communication, effective communication in a project is very, very important when it comes to mitigating against risks, because you get information as early as possible from any stakeholders of the project. That is very important for you to consider as a project manager. What the impact of effective communication in a project environment is to increase the outcome or the likelihood of the outcome of the project to be very good. I'll give you an example. You want your project to be delivered within the specific timelines. But your people, they're not aware. They don't know when are we supposed to finish a specific task, which deliverable or product is supposed to be done earlier than the other one. But if your communication is very effective, you've actually managed to identify the products or deliverables in a project, or even tasks or actions in a project. You've also prioritized them in terms of which one is supposed to go first and then the next one. You then communicate that with your project team. Your project team is going to take it as theirs. They're going to own it because they're going to be very clear on what exactly they're supposed to produce and by what time are they supposed to produce. So if your communication is very clear, you are increasing the likelihood of the project to be successful, for the project to achieve its objectives, for the project to complete its scope. So as a project manager, you must be very, very careful. You must make sure that your communication is effective if you want your project to be very successful. That is very critical. That is very important. You should take note of that. I've applied it in my project. You should be able to apply it in your project. So the first element in an effective communication setup environment is clarity and precision. So if you want your communication to be very effective in a project setup, make sure it's very clear, very precise and concise. What do we mean by this? I've seen some case studies on projects where there's no clarity. There's a lot of gibberish in some communication. There's too much information in the project, and you find there's too much even documentation in the project. So if you try to appreciate and understand what exactly was this communication, it will take you time to appreciate. But what I've done in my projects is to make sure, say for example, I'm sending an email, where it's very necessary to put it in bullet form, I do that. And I would advise you to do that. If it's not necessary to put it in bullet form, but make sure your English is very clear. I was involved in so many projects with different nationals. I think one of them, the highest I had, was about 11 nationals. And the language of the project was English, of course. You would find in such a setup, it was very difficult for me if I was going to use any jargon which is not familiar with anyone, if I was going to use any big words, English big words, no one was going to understand my communication. So having a challenge of a multinational setup environment or project, the best that I did to achieve to complete that project was to make sure that my communication is very clear and it's to the point. If ever there's a need to separate the communication, I'll do that. It's better for me to send 2, 4, 5 communications, but with very basic, precise, and concise information or message. That was very, very helpful because it was not confusing anyone. I've seen some other project members writing a very long email in terms of communication. So when you try to go through that long email, by the time you go to the end of the email, you might have forgotten everything that you have picked earlier. That kind of communication is not required in a project. It must be very clear and precise. The second element is timeliness. You want to make sure your communication is communicated or is passed, your message is passed at the right time. Say, for example, you have segmented your project into 4 milestones. I don't think it would make sense for you to start making communication about the first milestone when you are already doing the 3rd milestone. It does not make sense. Assuming it's a software development project, which I was also involved, you have gone past the analysis stage and also the build stage. You're already testing the solution. Then you start communicating about kickoff or you start communicating about analysis. That does not make sense. So timeliness of communication is very important. Say, for example, you want to communicate about end of a phase or end of a stage. It is better you do it exactly after end of that stage. You don't need to wait for another stage to start and then you start communicating. Maybe there are specific lessons you wanted to pick from that particular stage. How are you going to apply it when you are already past that particular phase? So it is very, very important for you as a project manager to make sure that one of the elements of your communication to make it effective is timeliness. Always communicate whatever needs to be communicated in a project in a timely manner. That is very important. The third element of effective communication in a project environment is relevance. I have to repeat this. Relevance of communication is very important. I've seen some other project managers making mistakes where they start communicating some information way past that milestone. Doesn't make sense. It must be relevant. It must be relevant within the project. It must be relevant outside the project. It also must be relevant to all the stakeholders that we have identified in a project. Remember, we've spoken about stakeholders before. So each and every stakeholder that you've identified, you need to also pick the relevant information they need and the timing of the information they need. That is very important and it's going to make your project very successful. I've done it before, I expect you to do the same. And you'll be successful, I was successful before. Then, the next element that we're going to look into this video, or we're going to discuss, is feedback. If you want to be successful in a project, just have an open mind to accept feedback from any of the stakeholders. It could be board members, it could be regulatory, it could be agents, it could be your own team members, it could be the legal team, it could be any other projects. For example, you might run a project that is going to provide input to the other projects in a program environment. So you need to also be getting feedback. Say, for example, after a certain meeting, you might also request feedback from the team in terms of the agenda of the meeting, in terms of what was discussed, in terms of what were the action items, the general feedback from the team members. Most of them, they give you raw feedback, which is very important for you as a project manager. Some can even come and say, I've seen it in my project. One of my members came and said, Oscar, this thing you're trying to do here is going to fail. I said, okay, fine. How is it going to fail? And why do you think it's going to fail? I can tell you I was surprised. This guy had done his research and he knew the direction we were taking, it was not going to be successful. So we had to mitigate against a number of risks that this guy was also pointing to me. So getting feedback from any project stakeholder is very important in a project. It makes your project very successful. Hear it from me. I've done it before. It works very well. You must have a feedback mechanism or feedback group mechanism within your project. That is very crucial and that is going to make your project successful. So the next element of effective communication in a project is what is called active listening. If you're a project leader, project member, project manager, you must learn to have active listening skills. This is very important because you want engagement. You also want the retention of project members in any discussion, in any communication. So if you're not able to listen to them, you'll find in most cases they'll keep quiet. They won't contribute. So you should be able to listen to whatever is coming from any project member, any project stakeholder. where it's necessary, like what I normally do, I also summarize the discussion points. Just to make sure that whoever was giving you information, we are communicating that I had time to listen to you, which is a very important point. And this is what I got from our communication. This is what I understood from our communication. So normally myself, I summarize the information, I send back to whoever brought it to me, so that it becomes very, very important. Active listening as a project manager or project leader is very important in a project environment. It's going to take you very far. It's going to enable the project to deliver objectives. It's going to make the project very successful. So you need to take note of that. Practice, it's a skill. Even me, I'm still perfecting it. It's a skill. Active listening, it's a skill. Because when you're talking to someone, there are people they have different ways of expressing themselves. Some of them might even touch on your nerves emotionally. So you need to let it go, understand, get the point, and then move on. That is very important. The next element of effective communication in a project setup is empathy. You should be able to put yourself in someone's shoes just to be able to understand or to feel how they're feeling. That will also help you to manage their emotions, and it will also help to build a relationship with any project stakeholder. You should be able to address people's concerns. How do you address that? If you don't understand, you don't feel like them, then it's very difficult for you to address it. Empathy helps you to build a trust amongst your project members. If you don't have any empathy in terms of your skills, then it will be very difficult to address some of these things. It will be very difficult to get some of the tasks completed, and it might also be very difficult to meet any specific deadlines. That is very important. So always have some empathy as a project member or project leader. That is very, very important. It's going to help the project. It's also going to help you to have a very successful project. So the last element for effective communication that we are going to go through in this video is consistency. I've seen so many project managers making that mistake. Their message is not consistent. Today they say something else about the same subject. Tomorrow they say something else about the same subject. Today it's very simplified. Tomorrow it's a very complicated message. The third day is one of the longest messages being shared. So in terms of effective communication, be very specific and be consistent. Always send the same message to the same stakeholders, to the right people. Don't send a message which is not consistent in any way to the project members. You are going to cause a lot of confusion. You can even reduce the momentum of the project because your communication is not consistent. Say, for example, I've seen another communication from one of the project managers. They were saying, the other day they were saying, we are supposed to work 3 hours over weekends. Then after a week or two, you see another communication which says, weekends are a working day. So you find members are asking themselves, if it's a working day, is it going to remain 3 hours? Or is it going to be a normal working day with 8 hours? Or even beyond 8 hours? Are we going to start at 8, 9, 7, or 10? Are we going to finish at 6? So consistency in communication in a project environment is very important. You should build that skill as a project manager, or project leader, or project member. It is very critical and very important that each and every time you make any communication is very consistent. That is very, very critical. The first communication which is done in most environments is verbal. So verbal communication can come in terms of face-to-face discussions. It's also verbal. Or it could be a phone call discussion. It's also a verbal. So verbal communication, in most cases, it has got a direct interaction with any of the stakeholders in a project. It could be from you as a project manager to a project team member, or from you as a project manager to a project board member, or you as a project manager to any regulatory authority. So verbal communication is one of the most common, according to my own view, communication in a project environment. You find most of the meetings, they are verbal, whether it's virtual or it's physical, but in most cases you find most of these meetings, they are verbal. The second type of communication is non-verbal. In this category, we are looking at, for example, emails. It's non-verbal, but it's also communication. You are sending email for someone to execute a specific task. It could be even a memo. It's also non-verbal, which you can send. Or these days, we have so many platforms. For example, it could be WhatsApp, which is very common. You can send it. That could be Skype, which is also very common. So this type of communication does not allow, or does not require that you should have a face-to-face, for example, or interactive. It's something you send, you wait, and then you get a response later. But it's also very important in a project environment. It could be a report, like I explained earlier. A report is also very, very important as a communication item, but it's also non-verbal. So when it comes to non-verbal communication, it could be body language, maybe in a meeting, or facial expressions in a meeting, or maybe it could be written communication. So written, we're talking of emails, we're talking of texts, any other communication, SMS that you can use in a project. That is very, very important. The other type of communication is also where there's internal communication, okay? So for internal communication, when we say internal, we're saying internal to the project. So each project has got its own boundaries. So when we say internal, it's within the boundaries of the project. In most cases, you'll find it starts from the project manager, you have your team leaders or team managers, and also you have your team members. So that is within the project setup. So when you're communicating within the project setup, you also have different ways of communicating to make things very clear. Assuming it's a technical project, obviously, you use what is called domain-specific language, which means you use the technical jargon so that everyone can understand. But you'll find that it will be difficult to communicate if you try to use the same jargon outside the project, especially to the project board members. You don't need to go as deep in terms of technical jargon as much, because these are outside members of the project. They just oversee the project, but they don't really get into the details of the project. So you have to water down your technical jargon as you move from one place to the other, or from one stakeholder to the other. So the next type of communication could be external. You want to communicate with the external world from a project. Remember, I said project has got boundaries. So anything that is coming outside of those boundaries is external communication. There may be reasons why you have to have this external communication. One of them is assuming your project is within a program, which means there are so many projects running, and you, as a project manager, you're running one of the projects. And that project is going to produce a product or a deliverable that is going to be used by other projects within the program. So that kind of communication is very important, especially in terms of progress. Because if you slow it down, if it's an input to another project, it's also going to slow down or to affect the timelines of the other project. So that is the kind of communication that we're talking about. It's external to a project. It could also be, say, for example, I've run some projects where the regulatory authority was also involved. So I had to be communicating with these regulatory people on I think it was 2 weeks basis, or fortnightly. There was a report I was producing, so that at least they can get it. So that was external communication. So in a project setup, outside the boundaries, you're doing external communication. You might also be producing a certain product, which is going to be used by a customer. The customer is outside the organization. So as the customer is expecting that product to be given to them, say for example, it's a part, machinery part, or even car part, a car part, or even machinery part, which is going to be consumed by another customer. So you might need to be communicating with the external customers, depending on the frequency that you have agreed, but they are also interested in knowing how are you progressing with your project, so that they can align with whatever internal, whether it's marketing they want to use, or maybe they also want to use it to mount additional machines in their organization. So that is also very important. That is also a scenario of external communication that you should expect in a project environment. So the next type of communication that you can have in a project environment is visual. To be honest with you, this is one of my best communication type that I use in my projects. Visual is very important. You want to be able to show progress of the project, especially when you're showing it to the project board. They are not very much interested in the details. They want to understand, you started on this particular day. How did you progress in terms of your project activities? For example, you might do it as a chart. Even a pie chart is okay. Even you can use it as a graphical chart, it's also okay, or timeline chart is also okay. I normally use those ones because when someone is seeing a visual representation of an update, they are normally quick to understand the clear picture of the progress than someone who is reading through some text. So I would advise you, where it's applicable, don't just jump into using a visual communication where it's not necessary. But I would advise, if you've got an option to use text and visual, you rather go for visual than text. So the other type of communication is also informal. There are so many ways I've gathered information myself. I've gathered information about some risks in a project, some information in a project, some delays in a project because of this informal communication. What do we mean by informal communication? You can even have a discussion with someone over lunch, dinner, or even coffee, tea, whatever you want to take. Then, to be honest with you, from my experience, The gold mine of information are the project team members. They give you raw information, very raw. They'll tell you exactly what is working, what is not working. They give you feedback right away. So if you want to have very effective communication in a project setup, make sure that you don't make everything very formal. You can even make it very informal. Even start chats with someone else on any communication platform, you might end up getting more information. There are some people, when they are gathered in a meeting, for example, or in a room, they find it very difficult for them to say something or to open up in terms of what they are seeing. It's not good for the project. But if you take them aside, engage them, talk to them informally, you get more information which you can use for the success of the project, which you can use to achieve the objectives of the project. So informal communication, always consider it in your project. Don't block it and say everything must be formal. Write me an email, call me, write me a report. There's some information which comes informally, but very important for the project. So you need to consider that if you're a project member, project leader, or even a project manager. Very, very important. The other type of communication is the formal one. I think most of the people, they're used to the formal communication. What do we mean by formal? These are like agreed formats. For example, you want to communicate on a report. You come up with a format for a report. Everyone, when they want to update you on any progress, they complete the report. We normally call them templates. They go through a certain template, filling in all the information, and then submit to you. Or else, they might even send you an email. I've seen some project managers requesting to receive emails every Friday about what someone has done over the week. Although, it might not be necessary, but there are certain projects you have to do that. You need formal communication. If it's going to be audited, or it's likely that most people are going to dispute whatever you're saying, then you might need to communicate formally. That is very important. Once you start communicating formally, it means there is a recording of what has to be done. That is very, very important. The first challenge that you face when it comes to communication in a project environment is miscommunication. So what do we mean by that? Like I said earlier, in some situations, if your message is not very clear, it will be very, very difficult for anyone to execute any of the communication or any of the expected results from your message. So your message must be very clear and concise so that there's no any ambiguity. There is nothing that is going to confuse people. If you do any of the miscommunication in a project, you are likely going to get wrong results. You are likely going to have missed deadlines, or you're going to have nothing being done at all in a project. And I don't think, as a project manager, that is what you expect. So always make sure that you reduce any miscommunication in a project setup. If whatever language you're using as a communication tool is not well understood by everyone, try to encourage some translation to their specific language so that at least if you are working in a multinational environment, like what I normally do, at least your communication is very clear to everyone. You cannot be using English in a project where English is not the first language, or you may not be using another language in a situation where not so many people, they understand that language. It will cause a lot of miscommunication. So always make sure that there's always enough communication, there's always precise communication, your message is very short and it's very clear. That is very important in a project environment. One of the challenges you face in a project environment is the language barrier. I was involved in a project where I had about 9 nationals, and English was not actually one of the preferred languages for some of the nationals. They could understand, but they would take time. So I could see that there was language barrier in a meeting. So what I used to do was to make sure that I simplify my communication as much as possible. Even if I've got very specific language domain or project management domain statements, I was not able to use some of them because I knew the moment I start switching to that language, so many people are not going to understand my communication. So a language barrier is one of the challenges you face in a project. These days, most projects are not done in one place. They have what is called different geographical locations. So when it comes to language, you need to be very, very careful. Even if it means you have to have someone who's going to translate, say from English to French, French to English, English to French, like that. The third challenge you will face when it comes to communication in a project setup is information overload. This day and age, you are likely going to have information overload because you have so many platforms that you can use for communication. For example, you can even have reports. I've seen others creating even some digital products like ebooks just for communication. I've seen others writing very long emails with so many attachments. So information overload in a project setup is one of the challenges you face when it comes to communication. When you overload people with a lot of information, most likely they are going to misunderstand your message. and most likely they are going to fail to achieve their objectives. They are going to fail to achieve or to deliver their products or deliverables or to complete their task. So it is very, very important for you to consider not overloading anyone with any information in a project environment. Always make sure that you provide the required information at the right time to the right people, not just to include everyone or every participant or recipient in any email where they are not supposed to be getting that. It will cause confusion. Always make sure you target your message, you target your audience, you target your stakeholders. That is very, very important when it comes to communication in a corporate environment. That is also very important when you want to limit the information overload in a project environment. The next challenge is inconsistency in terms of communication in a project environment. I've seen some project managers who are not very consistent in terms of their communication. Say, for example, you have agreed with the project team members that you are going to, on a weekly basis, you're going to give them updates, progress updates on what they've achieved, what they're yet to achieve, what are the milestones, closed milestones, imminent milestones, and so on and so forth. Then you're going for 3 weeks without making that communication. Then maybe the following weeks you do it every week, you stop again, you do it monthly. So consistency is one of the challenges you're going to face in terms of communication, not just from the project manager to the project team members. Also, it could be from project team members to the project managers, into the project and also outside the project. So there must be a lot of consistency when it comes to communication within a project. But that is one of the challenges you're going to face. Take it from me, I've seen it before. If your communication is not consistent, you are likely going to achieve your objectives. You are likely going to complete tasks within the deadlines. You are likely going to have budget overruns. So always make sure that as a project leader or project manager, you have some form of consistency in terms of your communication in a project. That is very, very, very important. Also, one of the challenges you're going to face when it comes to communication in a project environment is technological. What do we mean by that? This day and age, most people are having virtual projects. People are running projects virtually. That's what I mean. You don't need to be in one place. But you find that in some places, technology like internet is very slow or it's always disconnecting. And they might disconnect when you're actually discussing very, very important tasks or activities in a project. So you're likely going to face that technological issue when it comes to communication. There are also some countries where specific platforms, they're not allowed. For example, there are some countries where you cannot call someone on Skype, you cannot call someone on WhatsApp. So for you to be writing emails, which you know they are very slow in terms of getting feedback, you won't be able to be using those platforms going forward. That becomes one of the biggest challenges that you're going to face. So technology, you must choose the right technology from the beginning before you start a project, because that is very important. Which technology are you going to use? Which platforms are you going to be using for communication? Are they allowed in all the countries being represented by your project team members? Are they allowed by all the stakeholders countries or communication protocols which you are going to be engaging in the project? That is very important. One of the challenges you're going to face is lack of feedback. Feedback in a project is very important. You want to know what is working well, what is not working well. You want to record lessons learned from the project. You want to pick and also document any risks identified in a project. So if you're not having a proper feedback loop, or you're not getting enough feedback from the team, as a project manager, you cannot know everything. There are also cases you need other people to help you to either identify some risks, to help you also to mitigate some risks, to help you also to improve some either meetings or the way things are being done. It could be even quality. You want people to help you to improve on quality. You want feedback, either internal or external, to your customer, contractors, regulatory agents, and so on and so forth. So as a project manager, I would advise from my experience, you should always have a way to get feedback. It's going to be a challenge, but you should always have a way to get feedback. In some cases, you won't get any response. That is fair and fine. In some cases, you get. But the best is at least to try to have some feedback, and then you're able to move forward to make your project successful. One of the challenges you're also going to face is geographical location. What do we mean by that? Most projects are now being delivered remotely. But there are certain places where, for example, one of the projects I was involved, we had members who were 8 hours behind the project location. So which means when it's night in that area, it's day. We are waking. But when we are sleeping, the guys are up. So it was a big challenge, honestly. I've gone through that. It was a big challenge because sometimes you want to have some meetings, some calls, during the old hours in the other area. And also the members from that area, they also want to have some clarifications, and you guys, you're no longer in office. So you're most likely going to face a challenge when it comes to geographical location in a project scenario, especially if your members are dotted around the world. That is going to be a very big challenge in terms of time zone, especially time zone. Time zone is going to affect everything. So you need to come up with an approach which is very simplified. For example, I had to agree, that example I was giving earlier, I had to agree with the project member to make sure that they switch their time. We had no option because the client was 8 hours behind them. So we had no option. So we managed to negotiate that they sleep during the day in their time zone and they work during the night, so that we are able to synchronize our communication in the project. Those who are on site and those who are off site. It's something that I've used. It might not work in a scenario, but it's better to try to make sure that these time zone issues due to geographical differences, they are also mitigated, they're also resolved or even managed throughout the project. That is very, very important. I hope you've enjoyed the video so far. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to click the like button, the subscribe button, and the notification button so that you're the first person to be notified each time a new video is uploaded on this channel. It will also help the channel to grow. It can also help the channel to produce more videos like this one. So the next challenge is cultural differences. It will be very unusual or rare for you to run a project these days with people from the same culture. It's normally a multicultural environment. So when it comes to culture, especially when it comes to communication, the communication styles are different. And something that you might consider lightweight in terms of communication, it might invoke some emotions from another culture. So this is one of the challenges you're going to face. I also had the same challenge where, for example, starting of coming to office or starting time in office, we had agreed it's 8 a.m. But for some cultures, you'll find people start at 10, some even 9, 9:30, 8:30. So that was not allowing me to synchronize some of these activities because some people, they come at 8, some they come at 9. So cultural difference is something that you have to manage. You will never avoid it as long as you're in a multicultural environment. You cannot avoid it, but you can manage, you can find a way to coexist with these differences. So that is very important to consider. And it's going to be one of the challenges you're going to face. Whether you're running a small project or you're running a big project or medium project, cultural differences, you have to manage them throughout the project. The next challenge you're going to face is unclear roles and responsibilities. You should always make sure that you have clarified, you have defined the roles and responsibility of each and every stakeholder in the project. It could be a team member, it could be a board member, it could be a contractor, it could be a vendor, it could be an agent, or even regulator. There must be some clear roles and responsibilities. This is one of the challenges you're going to face because the moment you're trying to assign a specific role or responsibility, I've seen it, people will resist. They don't see it as their responsibility to do that. They want to push it to another team and so on and so forth. So from the beginning of the project, especially in the project startup stage or initiation stage, make sure that you have very clear roles and responsibility. Once you have roles and responsibility, it becomes very easy for you to specify the communication channels. Who is supposed to communicate what? Say, for example, you have an administrator. You don't expect your administrator to be communicating with your project board. You as the project manager are the one who is supposed to communicate with the project board. But the administrator is supposed to communicate with you as a project manager. So the roles and responsibilities must be very clear. In terms of communication, who is supposed to create what communication? It must be defined. This has to be done even during the stakeholder analysis matrix, where you're defining what information, who is supposed to receive what, when, and how. You also need to define the roles. That is the who part of it. Who is supposed to do what communication in a project. That is very critical. The last item, but not least, or the last challenge that you're going to face when it comes to effective communication in project environments is the resistance to change. So, most of the projects, they have certain objectives or intentions. You might end up with a result, or you might even end up with a product, or maybe you might end up with a service. But as you create this product, service, and result, what I've seen in one of my projects, I've done a project in one of the banks, and they were using a certain old system which we were supposed to interface, and there was no need to have any members who were taking information from the old system and then typing it into the new system. So that whole department had to be reassigned to other activities within the organization. So when we're trying to communicate to them to try to get more requirements, to try to understand what exactly do they do so that we can automate that process, there was a lot of resistance. So communication, or trying to get any communication through members in a project, you're going to face it. Some will resist, because they're in the project not because by design, but their department heads, they just requested them to go into the project. So their mindset is not actually about the project. So you find them, they'll be resisting so many things. So your communication should also be clear, so that you try to mitigate against this risk of resistance. If your information is not clear, you find a lot of resistance, because people, they don't understand what you're trying to communicate. People, they don't appreciate what you're trying to communicate. So that is also very, very important as a project manager. If you want me to create additional videos based on what we've covered in this video, including the concepts, the techniques, or you've got any specific clarification that you might want to understand, let me know in the comment section below.